Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode, number 62, is Please Stop Wasting Fabric. But before we get started, I first want to let you all know that I have made up kits for this quilt, the Amish Bargello we showed last week. I have the kit in this colorway that you've already seen, and we made up two other colorways. This is blue and green, and we also have a pink and purple. But we will also custom cut if you want another colorway. We'll be happy to do that for you. We also have in stock now the cones of the fusible thread. Many people have said that they've not been able to find it, but we have a couple and I can get more from my distributor. So if you want any of these things, please give us a call between 10 and 5 during the week. It's Central Time, 847-272-7245, or email me at any time at quiltersheaveninc@gmail.com. Now, let's move on to the opinion. If you're a precision piecer, and I know if you've watched my channel for any length of time, I want my corners to meet. I don't want points cut off. And when something happens that doesn't look quite right, things don't meet, I rip and resew. Di from Sister Chicks had a really good fixing of a problem in her recent Memorial Day quilt video, and we will have a link to that video in the description. It was a simple 3 1-yard cut quilt, patriotic, red, white, and blue, and simple blocks. I think it was an hourglass. I can't even remember. They were all simple, 4-patch. And she sewed one set of seams together, and it wasn't quite right. And in the video, she showed how she took it apart and looked at the block, and she shows you exactly what happened wrong. If you construct a component of a block wrong and then try to put it in, it's not going to work most of the time. If you have too big of a seam allowance somewhere, too small of a seam allowance somewhere, you're going to have a problem. So I encourage you to watch this video to see how she took it apart and diagnosed what the problem was and fixed it and put it back together so that her quilt had all her corners meeting perfectly and no points cut off. So thank you, Di, for showing people how to do it. Now, let's get to the episode. Please stop wasting fabric. Why do I say that? A common occurrence here is a husband calling and saying that his wife is no longer sewing and he's got a lot of fabric to donate. Books and patterns too, sometimes even a sewing machine. Sometimes it's children, their mother has died, and a lot of times it's a quilter who's just downsizing and needs to get rid of some of their stash. And the amount of stuff that comes in here is unbelievable. And I have to go through the fabric and sort what is good for Project Linus. They don't take Christmas. They don't take Halloween. What is good for the church group. So what I'm suggesting is if we can, as quilters, use up the leftovers and not waste as much fabric, there will be much less to have to deal with later. So, what are the drivers of waste? There's a few that I identify. One is inefficient block construction. We've talked about flying geese, and I have that in one of my earlier episodes, and we'll have a link to that video. There's the fast flying geese method versus the rectangles and squares, and with the rectangles and squares, it produces a lot of waste. Also, half square triangles, quarter square triangles, and combo units. We also have a video on that very early on in my YouTube channel. We'll have a link to that one too. And then snowballing. And that term you'll hear people use, and what it means is putting a square on top of the corner of a block and drawing a line, sewing on it, and cutting off the excess. These are all things that produce triangle waist. And many of you will send me comments and say, but I sew those together and I make quilts with them. Well, there are many of you who do, and there are a lot of you who don't. And how do I know? It comes into the bags in the donations to the shop to process for Project Linus and other charities. So there are a lot that don't get used. Another example is lack of planning. And that goes to the think before you cut. We've talked about that before. A good example of that is if you decided you wanted to make 10-inch quarter square triangle units, you need to start with, depending on what method you're using, an 11 1/4 or an 11 1/2 inch square. Well, you can only get 3 of those across the width of the fabric, and then the rest is waste. But if you change your size to 8 1/2 inches, then you need 9 3/4 or 10-inch square. You can get 4 of those across the width of the fabric. So you get not only 4, but what's left over is a much smaller piece. So far less waste. This for sure is not the only example, but it's just think about what you'll get out of your full width of fabric and maybe make adjustments based on using more of it rather than less of it. The last thing that I see that drives waste a lot is being married to pre-cuts. There are some people who only want to use pre-cuts, and I can tell you by the amount of donations I get that have partial pieces of pre-cuts, and I'm going to show you some soon, that I know they are not getting all used. And they don't get used all because sometimes you don't like 1 or 2 or 5 of those squares, and other times it's just because you buy a jelly roll that's 40 strips, but the pattern says you use 34 of them. So right there, 6 aren't being used. The other thing that goes back to inefficient block construction is oftentimes if you're using pre-cuts, you are driven to inefficient block construction. An example is if you used a 5-inch square, you'd have to have half of it be waisted. But if you cut a 6-inch square, you could get 2 pieces out of it and have far less waste. And I'm going to show you an example of that also. But if you have to use the size of the pre-cut and you don't have any option to cut it a teeny bit bigger to do less waste, you have more waste. So those are the main things, and now I'm going to show you some examples. In my last example of saying if you had a 5-inch square and couldn't cut it a little bit bigger, here is one that I made up of 3 1/2-inch square and 4-inch square. So if you have directions that tell you to draw a line corner to corner and sew on that line, and then cut a 1/4 inch away, that's your first clue that you don't want to do it that way, because that gives you a lot of waste. So if I pressed this, I now would have 2 squares, half square triangles, and I would have this amount of waste. But if you use a little bit bigger squares, a 4-inch square, and you draw your line corner to corner and sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of the line and then cut apart, you have 2 squares, which if they were pressed, they would look like this. And then you have to trim them down to the correct size, and this is your waste. So that goes right into the dog bed pile. You don't have to do anything more with it. These, if you're going to say I'm going to use them, you need to sew them together here and then save them and put them together into something. Not like we have enough projects to do, or I should say don't have enough projects to do. So that's your first clue. And this is the same thing with the quarter square triangles and the combo units. You want to use the most efficient way to do it, so this is the kind of waste that you have, and you don't have to come up with a project for these. Now, the other thing I talked about was the snowballing. And in snowballing, it's you just take a square, and if you look at the directions in this square, I don't call it a book, it actually does come in book form now, but the directions tell you to take the square of the size that you're going to make and put 4 squares on the corner, sew corner to corner, and then cut off the excess waste. So I did that here, and then here I used the technique of cutting off the corners first. So I cut these corners off first using Deb Tucker, of course, the usual Deb Tucker thing. This is called corner pop, and what it has you do is take off the corner first, and then instead of cutting 4 squares to put on the 4 corners, you cut 2 squares a little bit larger, and all the size numbers and what you have to cut are in her little instruction booklet. And then you put those on and then trim your square up. So while I still had the squares cut off, I don't have the pink cut off. I just have the little bit of square up. So it isn't quite half the waist, but it's a little bit less than half the waist. So it's a real good way to save some waste. And if you've ever done any of the Elizabeth Hartman patterns, she has you do the corners on all kinds of pieces here, where you put the corner on, a square on, sew corner to corner, and then cut. So if you are doing several blocks, like these are all the same size, so you could cut, and I think this one, yeah, V, they all 4 of these are the same size. So instead of cutting 4 squares, you could cut 2 squares, a little oversized, and not have near as much waste. So the cutting off the corners first and then cutting a bigger square to add is a great way to save. And I don't have an example here of the fast flying geese, but most of you know what it is, of using 1 big square for the goose and 4 small squares for the sky. And like I said, there'll be the link to that video, but it's all over YouTube. You can find other people who do it too. But you always end up with way less waste. So let's move on to the pre-cuts. These are some of the things that have been in recent donations, and you can clearly tell that they are leftover jelly roll strips. Look at this pile. And then these are 5-inch squares. I mean, you can tell with the pinked edges that they're pre-bought pieces. And then this is part of jelly rolls that wasn't used. Now, I've had some, and I couldn't find it to show you today, that were really bad, that they were almost a full half a strip, just a little bit less than a half a strip. So if you buy a jelly roll and you only use half of it, that's a lot of waste. And I don't think I said this at first, but this is not a video about saving money. This is a video about trying to keep things out of the landfill and getting used. This saving fabric will eventually save money, but that's not my focus. My focus is using your scraps, not making excess waste. The next thing in the pre-cuts here are the 10-inch squares. And so often you'll see 10-inch square patterns, and they'll say, so go ahead and pick out 5 of them you don't like, or substitute any other number you want. But there's always seems to be some leftovers, either because you don't like them or, like I said before, the pattern just doesn't use them all. But you can look at these pieces here and you can see the pinked edges here. You can tell that with the pinked edges here, these are hunks that were not used from the Layer Cake 10-inch square pack. And here's, just these are squares here on the bottom. Just not used. So all this end up being donated, and now I have to try to find a home for these. So I'm thinking that if you had something like this, how about just making a 4-patch? And keep making 4 patches and then find something in your stash for an alternate block. Super easy, sew it up. Don't even let it get into your scrap heap. Use it before it gets there. Next, I want to show you some of the bags of fabric that I've gotten. I have in front of me bags that I've received in recent donation boxes, and you can tell that they are leftovers from other projects. Look at this, all this pink and green really could make a great quilt. How about this one? Look at how cute this fabric is, and what a lovely little baby quilt this could be made into. And here's a huge bag of neutral strips. Another big bag, pink and gray. Look at how pretty those fabrics are. And then this is one that I'm actually really looking forward to playing with. And this is a K Fawcett bundle that has pieces all taken out of it. And I give fabric, as you know, to Project Linus. I love this one. How about that hunk cut out of it? But they don't want any of these kind of fabrics that are too scrappy, that it's all cut up. They don't want those for their fabric giveaway. So I try to find places to use them, whether it's me myself or I find somebody else to do it. But if you could do me a favor and continue sewing, we've talked several times about don't put the leftovers in your scrap heap, keep sewing till they're done. If you kept sewing with this until this looks like you get 2 or 3 quilts out of it, and don't get it into the scrap heap, then it doesn't become an issue for somebody else. So you can use your leftover 2.5-inch strips to make something, and that would be really, really helpful. So that is our episode today. If you found value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next Monday, happy sewing.